1 Kings chapter 11. All right. The first 10 chapters were like the top 10 plays of Solomon's life. Chapter 11, it will share some of the downfalls that he faced in his life, and will end with eventually his death and the passing on of his kingdom. And I want to share with you, because I'm going to come in a little hot on this chapter, there's certain things that God highlights for us that are so critical for us to understand even in our life today. Now, what happens to Solomon is not going to happen to us exactly, but the principles of what takes place are so important for us to process and understand so that we can avoid some of the challenges that Solomon would face in his life and in the generations to come with his kids. Let's jump into the chapter. Verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Okay, I want to address a few things real quick on this. Number one, as we talked about earlier, Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, but in the trading and in the allegiances and alliances he would make, it's highly likely that he continued to add relationships. Now, God has called one man and one woman to be together. We see that in Genesis. We see that in the beginning. There are things that take place in the Bible that are historical, but it doesn't mean that God liked them. There were men in the Old Testament who would take multiple wives to have many more children. Just because historically it took place doesn't mean that God was happy about it, that God was in agreement with it, or that God was for it. We see in the life of Solomon that he was doing things because he had desires of his flesh and he lacked self-control in areas of his life. And because he was never content, because he always struggled with satisfaction, as we can read in the book of Ecclesiastes, he would do things to try to fill a void in his life that only Jesus can fill. And in your life and in my life, sometimes there's going to be this temptation to fill or to fulfill voids that only God can fill. Now, I want to clarify something. There have been people who have said, well, it says in the Bible, you must not intermarry with them. And sometimes people will say, well, there's themes in scriptures where we shouldn't intermarry amongst cultures. That's not what God says. When the New Testament says do not be unequally yoked, it's saying believer and unbeliever. In the Bible, it says there's no Jew nor Gentile, but believer and unbeliever. Case in point, there are many instances in the Old Testament where Gentiles would come in and would marry Jewish people. The reason they were able to marry them is because they served God and they were grafted in. You say, give me an example so I can believe it. Would love to. You have Rahab, the prostitute, who they rescued from Jericho, and she married a man by the name of Salmon and had a son by the name of Boaz and is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. You say, well, that's a one-off. Give me another one. All right, fine. Her son Boaz, who's in the lineage of Christ, he married a woman by the name of Ruth, who was a Moabite. She was grafted into the culture of Israel. Why? Because she loved the Lord. She said, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. It's not about the color of your skin or your nationality. Please do not miss that. It is about whether or not you love the Lord. Practical application for today. If you're single and you're looking for someone to marry, if they don't love Jesus, you don't need to date them. I'm just going to tell it like it is. If they don't love Jesus, you don't need to date them. Why? Because you don't need to base a lifelong relationship with someone who is not using wisdom in their eternal relationship. And all that will do is drag you down and bring you down and cause pain in your future. Now, Solomon, because he was king, felt like he could do whatever he wanted, and there was things that he did that didn't go in alignment with God's word. There's things that he did that did agree with God's word, but then there's things that he did where he's just like, I'm going to do what I want to do. And because of that, he introduced pain into his future. God doesn't restrict us to punish us. God brings about restrictions to hedge us. The hedge of God protects us from the attacks of the enemy, but the hedges of God also protect me from my stupid. Because there's stupid in all of us, if we're honest. And here's what's so important. It says that he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Okay, one, I don't even know how he can remember 1,000 names. Probably couldn't. He just wanted what he wanted, and he took what he wanted. And here's the problem. And his wives led him astray. When we get into relationships with people who don't love God, they will lead us away from God. And he is not using restraint. He's the wisest man on earth, but he's not using it. You can have all the wisdom, all the knowledge, all the book smarts in this world. You can memorize this book from cover to cover. But if you don't apply it to your life, it's like in one ear and out the other. James talks about it. It's like looking in a mirror and walking away and forgetting what your face looks like. And it says he was led astray. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. There was a season where his heart was fully devoted to God, but then there became a season where his heart was divided. And God does not want us to be divided from him, because division is dangerous. Division is sin. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. I want you to catch this. He did not abandon God. He mixed culture with God. And one of the great dangers in culture today is this, I don't call it doctrine, but it's almost like this culture of mixing. Jesus talks about it in Revelation. He says, I'd rather you be hot or cold. Don't be lukewarm. I'll just spit you out. And the world tries to mix in humanism with following Christ. And he, in his mind, thought, well, I can do both. And the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, as if to say, God had shown up. God had revealed himself. Like you and I, maybe you have, but I haven't. I haven't had God show up in my life. Like it says that God showed up and had a conversation with Solomon. Like it's one of those, like, you know that God's legit. You know that God ain't playing. And God tells you what he's going to do, and God does it. And in all of this, God warns him, serve me, follow me. Don't expose yourself to this. If you expose yourself to this, there will be pain. But he does it anyways. And although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant, my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. We're going to talk more about his adversaries in a minute, but in Ecclesiastes, Solomon would pour out his heart, even in Proverbs. He would write all this wisdom to a son, but in Ecclesiastes, he would share with his heart, what does it gain a man to have all this, knowing that the next generation could squander it? Solomon sees and knows that Rehoboam, his son, is going to ruin so much, and respectfully, his son's an idiot. And Solomon's the wisest man on earth. I know that he can see it. But if I could, I'd like to interject and go a little bit deeper. The Bible does not say this. I want to be very clear. This is my opinion based off of the context of what we read. But the Bible shares with us how successful Dad is in business and how worldly all his wives were in culture. And Rehoboam, not to make excuses for his poor choices, was most likely raised in a home where Daddy was always working, making money, and Daddy was always going around and filling himself with whatever he desired. And Mama was going after gods that weren't in alignment with God. And Rehoboam was raised in a dysfunctional home. And because of that, there were choices he would make in the future that were not wise. I share that with us for this reason. Don't neglect the home. It's our most important ministry. Our spouse and our kids. To love on them, to care for them. Yes, God can bless you. I believe God will bless you. But don't so pursue prosperity and lavishes like Solomon did, and don't go and pursue culture and other gods like his wives did, don't miss it. Because if you miss it, you'll miss God. And the Bible tells us very clearly in verse 9 that the Lord became angry. God had the right to be upset because God looked out for him and God went before him and God warned him and God cared for him. God set him up to win. But Solomon made choices later on in his life that set him up in the next generation to fail. And because of that, there was resistance and adversaries that Solomon would face in his life that he didn't have to, but God allowed him to. Verse 14. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men of Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then taking people from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. So we have this young man who was, his whole nation and people were slaughtered, and so you can imagine that there's a bitterness in his heart towards the Israelites. And it says that Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. Then Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go, that I might return to my own country. It's time to go get some revenge." "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." And God raised up against Solomon another adversary. So the Bible begins to tell us that God is allowing these adversaries to be raised up. It's as if God could stop it, but he chooses not to. Rezon, son of Elidah, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. When David destroyed Zobah's army, Rezon gathered a band of men around him and became their leader. They went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel. So we see these adversaries begin to flare up against Solomon. And then there's a man by the name of Jeroboam. And he would rebel against Solomon, and the kingdom would eventually be split as God had foretold. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zerada, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the count of how he rebelled against the king. For Solomon had built the terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. This is foretelling what's going to happen in the time of Rehoboam, Solomon's son. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. I will take the kingdom from his son's hand, and I will give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do what I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands as David my servant did, I will be with you." Same promise he gives to David, same promise he gives to Solomon, same promise he would say to us. If you do what I ask, I'll go before you. I'll be with you. I'll build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. As in saying, we still know that Jesus, the Christ, is going to come from the line of David. There is going to be humbling that they would walk through, because the Bible says that the Lord resists the proud, but he also gives grace to the humble. When we humble ourselves, God shows grace. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. And Solomon's life closes in this. As for the other events of Solomon's reign and all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. And in chapter 12, the story will get very interesting. I look forward to sharing it with you. Be blessed today.